some terms we need to, whoops, primary succession and secondary succession, and that should become apparent what the difference is. Does anybody know what the difference is before we start? No? Okay, well, we'll come back to those. I said I'd keep going on about energy, and I'm going to keep bringing energy back into this. And so modern humans are pretty unusual in that we have more energy than we know what to do with in terms of food. But most organisms, certainly that live in the wild, they are short of energy. And so evolution has led to people storing additional energy when it was in surplus to guard against future shortages. In other words, laying down fat in mammals. If we look at plants, if plants get more energy, that means they can grow more. What's the advantage of growing more? It means that they can get taller. And if they get taller, in turn, they get more energy again. And that cycle continues. They get until they have energy which they can use to make new plants. Okay, so the more energy organisms have, the more they can reproduce. And that means the more successful they will be in evolution. So evolution will favour organisms which can obtain more energy. It's the same principle with animals. Animals, I mean, in many ways, energy is more important for animals. I mean, it's not more important, but animals use it for a wider variety of things. So movement, for example. Animals that have more energy can produce more offspring. And again, they will make more copies of their alleles. And that means they will be more successful in evolutionary terms. And they will eventually dominate. Animals that have less energy or are able to obtain less energy will become extinct. So energy is synonymous with life. And organisms that are deprived of energy die. That's a fairly obvious thing to say. In terms of distribution and abundance, if you remember, distribution is where organisms live, abundance is how many of them there are. Plants and algae obviously need light to photosynthesize, and they need water and nutrients as well to make glucose and all the other molecules, that proteins, cellulose that they need. Animals get energy by eating plants or eating other animals that have eaten plants. So the form of energy that animals and plants take in, but they're both highly dependent on it. We looked at different habitats last week, and I just want to have a look at one in particular, which is the tundra. And I think actually I said last week the tundra was the bit just below the Arctic Circle, but in fact the Arctic Circle is included in the tundra. So that you can see on the little map there, the dark blue is the tundra, and that would include certainly parts of the Arctic. And if you just look at that picture, you can see that not a lot grows there. What are the particular problems for plants growing on the tundra then? Anybody suggest?
Cold climate.
It's cold, right? So how does that affect the plants?
They have to have more energy to, I was going to say keep warm, but I don't know if plants have to keep warm.
Well, they don't, but how are plants affected by temperature?
Can it not affect the photosynthesis?
Yes. In what way?
Do the enzymes in that slow down?
Yes, right. So all the chemical reactions will be going very slowly, and that means even if there's sufficient light, they will only be able to grow very slowly. So that's one challenge. What else? What else do plants need?
Is it a desert?
I think the Arctic isn't actually a desert, but you're probably right. There's not a lot of rainfall, and a lot of the moisture will be locked up as ice for a lot of the year. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why there's no trees, because they can't. I mean, trees have fairly deep roots. There is permafrost, which means it is permanently frozen, and the trees cannot get moisture from deep in the soil. So that what water there is pretty much on the surface or on the top bit of the soil. What else do plants need to photosynthesize?
Sunlight.
Right. So
is there reduced amounts of sunlight?
Shorter days?
Yeah. So there's both.
Same thing.
Well, they're both correct. They're not the same thing, but they're both correct. So if you remember last week, we looked at the fact there's less intensity of light in the poles than there is at the equator, because the sun is lower in the sky. So there's certainly less light. And also in the winter, in the Arctic Circle, there's 3 months with no light at all. It's permanently dark. So I think I read somewhere there's only about 50 to 60 days a year that plants can actually grow when you're getting to the very high latitudes. So certainly a lot of the year they just can't grow at all. And when they can grow, they tend to grow fairly slowly. So that's why one of the reasons there's no large plants. Is there an advantage to organisms living there, though?
Less competition.
Yeah, exactly. So there's much less competition. So if they are adapted to live in those sort of places, then they pretty much have a free reign. The problem with rainforests, it's got ideal growing conditions, lots of moisture, lots of nutrients, nice and warm. But the big problem in rainforests is competition. It's competition for space, and the plants that live there have to grow very rapidly in order to get any light at all. Otherwise, they get overshadowed. So there's pros and cons to all sorts of habitats. I mean, these two pictures, again, we're kind of moving on to succession now, is really designed to show you that it's wrong to think of an ecosystem as a static, stable place. I suppose the most stable will be things like rainforests, because the climate's fairly constant. But certainly the North or South poles, you've got very wide contrasts from summer to winter. So in one, you're going from 3 months of complete darkness. At the other end of the year, you're getting 3 months of permanent sunlight. So they change from winter to summer and from year to year. They're changing. There's always been cycles of what do you call ice ages. About every 100,000 years, isn't it? We're supposed to have an ice age. So there are also variations in how close the Earth gets to the sun over hundreds of years. So there are, and the sun's activity also changes. So there's lots of reasons why the average temperature of a year can vary in the long term. So there can also be long-term changes to ecosystems known as succession. So that's really the main focus of what we're doing this lesson. I probably should have put this a bit later, actually. So first of all, primary succession. Primary succession starts with bare rock, or sand or shingle, or even open water. But it means a habitat where no life has existed before. So it could be volcanic, lava or magma that's solidified, and then life starts to develop on it. It could be new water, or it could be sand which has been moved around from one place to another. And obviously it's a very challenging place to live. Very few organisms can survive there because there's no soil and there's very few nutrients. So the first, I'm going to put this in 4 stages. The The first stage is called colonization. That's when you start to get the first organisms living there. And the first organisms that arrive are things like algae or lichens. And the two pictures there, the top one is a lichen. I'm going to just say a little bit more about them in a minute. The bottom picture is algae. Both of these photosynthesize, but neither of them are plants. So algae are protists. Lichens are actually a combination of a fungus and an alga. So they're both photosynthetic, but neither are in the kingdom of plants. And what they do is they're able to cling to the tiny crevices in the rock to hold on, and they photosynthesize. Their roots start to break up the surface of the rock and to make it more accessible to other organisms. And when they die, they start to provide nutrients as they decompose. So those are the colonizers, algae and lichens. I think lichens it's worth just having a look at, because we don't do a lot about them further down the school. They are a mutualist relationship between a fungus and an alga. And you can see the little diagram there. Most of it is the fungus. You've got the fungal hyphae, which are the long threads, and you've got the little rootlet type things called they're called rhizines, which is not a word I've come across before. Those are the things which anchor them to the rock. And then higher up you've got algae, which do the photosynthesis. The fungi provide a protection for the algae, and I think they also prevent them drying out as well. Whereas the algae photosynthesize and produce sugars, some of which provide energy for the fungus. The second stage, then after the colonizers, is small plants, which are mosses. Mosses that do belong to the kingdom of plants. They're probably the most primitive plants. They arrive as spores, and they again start to, they've got, if you look at the diagram, they have small roots. They have no vascular tissue, no xylem or phloem, so they tend to be quite low. I'm sure you all know what a moss looks like. But they can cling to the rock and the lichens, and they start to build up more organic matter, and that starts to form a very thin soil, and that enables water to be held there as well. The moss is reproduced by spores, so they're very simple plants. So that's stage 2. The third stage is then you start to get smaller plants and bushes. Shallow rooted plants germinate from seeds, and all the time the plants are kind of getting bigger. You're getting more organic matter provided, which provides more soil and more nutrients, more water. So all the time bigger and bigger plants are able to grow, and as the plants get bigger, they grow taller and they get the light, and they start to outcompete the smaller plants. So we move through a stage. By now the colonizers probably don't exist anymore in that habitat. They've been outcompeted, and the mosses again will be outcompeted as well. Mosses have to grow in fairly damp environments. They're not good at retaining water. I think they've got very thin cuticles on their leaves, so they do dry out quite easily. And then the last stage is what's called the climax community. And so by now the soil depth is becoming deeper and deeper, and we're able to get bushes and eventually trees growing. And you tend to get one dominant, or not necessarily one, but one or two dominant species which outcompetes every other plant. And in England, certainly the middle and south of England, the dominant species, the dominant climax community is oak forest, and that's at the top. Further north, presumably because it's colder, and the dominant is the Scots pine, which is obviously a conifer, and that's adapted for retaining water, drier conditions possibly. It's more slow growing, but it is adapted to colder environments. I would think oak is more, it favours the warmer climates a bit further south. This is again, this is in the book. So this would be a primary succession as well on the beach. And so starting with sand, and as you move back from the sea, you can see the various stages. So where the trees are, that would have been colonized hundreds of years ago. And that's moved through all 4 stages. In the middle, you've got the small bushes, so stage 3, and then down by the sea, you're getting stage 1 and stage 2. You probably wouldn't get a great deal in the way of lichens on sand, so that they're more suited to rock. So it won't necessarily all follow exactly the same pattern. Different habitats will favour different sorts of organisms. Yeah, certainly on the beach, you've got additional pressures, which are the wave action, possibly wind, because of the salinity, the high salt content. Again, it will favour organisms plants which can tolerate higher levels of salt. Right, so colonisation. How do we? Someone's a plane, unheard of. Can anybody suggest how the colonisers get to a new piece of rock? So there's a volcanic eruption in the middle of the sea, and you get a new island, bare rock formed. There is in the book they mention one. There's an island called Surtsey, which I think is off Scotland, which was thrown up by a volcano in, I think it's about 1961, and that's actually been quite carefully studied to see succession over what is now 60 years. But how would the first colonisers get there?
Swim.
Carried in the wind.
Yeah, I think the wind is one of the more likely ones. They're not really capable of swimming. What might carry them there?
Would it be from other species, like other like animals?
Sticking to other animals, isn't it?
Yeah, what sort of animals?
Birds.
Like birds.
Right, birds. Yeah. So quite often birds. I mean, birds are quite good at dispersing seeds and spores as well. They might well bits of lichen and so on. So either wind blown in the case of lichens and fungi possibly, or carried by things like birds. Why? So, okay, what are the pioneer species again then? Just to recap.
Moss.
Algae.
Fungus. Lichen and algae.
Lichen and algae, right? Yes, lichens and algae. There's also actually, it's worth mentioning bacteria. The first forms of life, when the Earth was a molten ball and it solidified to form a crust. The first forms of life would be very simple cells like bacteria, and they used to form mats, a mat of bacteria, which I think now, I'm not sure you really get those now, and they were called stromatolites, I think, like a mat of bacteria, and then other forms of life evolved and fed on those. I think now you wouldn't get those forming, presumably because they're too slow. I don't know, but it would be more the lichens that would be the pioneers. There are some bacteria which do photosynthesize, and they're called the cyanobacteria, cyano bacteria. I think I've already answered this, but why do plants then outcompete the pioneer species?
Because they grow taller, so they get the light.
Yeah, so they grow taller. They outshade them. They prevent light getting to them, and if the colonizers can't get light, then they can't really. They are producers, so they will die out. What is soil?
Moss. I don't know.
Well, soil is actually it's partly particles of rock. If you remember last time we talked about the size of the particles, so sand has big particle sizes, clay has very small particle sizes. So it's partly rock particles, and it also has an organic content which is called humus, not hummus, but humus, Humus, and that is basically decomposing organic matter, so dead plants and animals that have broken down. And if you look at a soil, if it's a light brown color, that means it's got very little organic content. Organic matter is dark brown or black. So compost, which is organic matter, is very dark. So that a dark soil has generally got a much higher organic content, and it also gives it a much better structure with air pockets, and it's able to hold more water as well. So that's really what's happening over the formation of the soil, is the rock is being broken down to make the particles of rock, and also the dead organic material is accumulated over hundreds of years to mix with those soil particles to build up a good soil which bushes and trees can arrive in, can grow in. So trees, why do trees arrive so late?
Because they need the soil and stuff to be there first, because they need deep roots.
Yeah, because trees have fairly deep roots. I mean, apart from anything else, trees will fall over if they didn't have deep roots because they're in the wind. So they need to have deep roots. They need to have the depth of soil in order to stay upright. And they become dominant because they're obviously much taller. And I mean, it's worth saying flowering plants are more sophisticated because they have things like xylem and phloem, which allow them to transport materials around and to grow more quickly. There are four groups of plants, really. The most primitive are the mosses. Then you've got things like ferns, which again, they don't have a proper vascular system. They don't have xylem, so they're limited into how tall they can grow because they can't transport water that far. And then you get the conifers, and finally the flowering plants. So those are the four types of plants, and that's the order in which they have evolved. The mosses were around first, then the ferns, then the conifers, and flowering plants, in fact, evolved more recently than mammals. So there were mammals around on Earth before there were flowering plants, which I think is sometimes quite surprising. One thing we haven't really talked about there is animals, and obviously animals will be part of this succession as soon really as you start to get any plant life producers, then potentially animals can survive. So how would they get there?
They find this new place with no competition and then sort of stay.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, again, birds are probably the first things that would arrive on an island in the sea because they can get there easily. But other animals find ways somehow of getting across water, and sooner or later, so insects might arrive, and it's a bit like plants. As the succession continues, that ecosystem can then support larger and larger animals. Large predators need a big area with quite a good support system of smaller animals that they can feed off. So it's obviously going to be the smaller ones that arrive first. Biodiversity, I think, is you did biodiversity in topic 4, didn't you? Did you? Anybody?
Honestly, I don't know.
Okay. How do you think the biodiversity changes then? So initially, throughout the succession.
At the start, the biodiversity will be quite simple. It'll just have
Quite low.
Like, quite low. It'll have like a few like the starter plants, and then as the ecosystem develops, the biodiversity is going to get much greater because more and more things are going to be able to live there and able to support themselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
When the trees come up, doesn't the biodiversity drop as one species of that tree like outcompetes everything or whatever?
Yes, quite often. That's absolutely right. So the biodiversity will initially be low because there's only a very small number of life forms that can actually survive. That will increase as it develops. But actually, when you reach a climax community, quite often the biodiversity then decreases because a lot of the intermediate stages die out, and you just have the climax species and maybe one or two others which are adapted as well. So it kind of the biodiversity kind of increases and then possibly goes down a bit as well. And just in terms of the time it takes, we are really talking hundreds of years for a habitat capable of supporting trees to develop. It will obviously depend on the conditions. It will depend on temperature and water and the kind of natural environment. It will vary, but it's not going to happen in 20 or 30 years because to develop the soil takes a long time. Right. So that's primary succession. The second type is secondary succession. And in secondary succession, you are starting, rather than starting with bare rock, you start with the soil already in place. So probably the best example of this is in somewhere like Australia, where you have a forest fire, all the plants and animal life will be removed, but you've still got the soil there, and that can then be recolonized much more quickly. You don't need the lichens and the moss stages because other species, plants, are able to grow because of the soil already being present. So that's a picture of groundsel, which we get you'll get that on the school field. That's a very quick growing species, so it's a kind of opportunist. When the ground is being cleared, some seeds will remain in the soil. A lot of seeds are resistant to things like fire, and in fact there are some species of plants which have evolved that they need fire to actually kind of activate them to grow and germinate. So the groundsel would shoot up quickly, but then the grasses will grow and outcompete it, and eventually you'll get back to the climax community. So primary succession is bare rock, secondary succession is soil, and obviously secondary succession is a much quicker process. That would be, you'd be back within decades or even a few years to getting trees, because it's the building up of the soil that really takes the time. There's one more term, which is deflected succession, and this is where succession that's been affected by humans. So any sort of farming would be deflected succession. Obviously, growing crops is having a major effect on the natural processes, but also introducing animals, whether they're sheep or things like deer, or I mean, even rabbits in Australia would be an example of that because they weren't natural. Dredging a river, again, is interrupting the natural process and would be an example of deflected succession. Right, that is it. So let's go back and get the camera. I don't know, I think that hopefully that's fairly straightforward. Anybody got any questions?
Nope.
No.
Right. What I would like you to do then, to just turn this off. Right. I've put, oh, you can't see that, can you? Let me just share this with you. So on Teams, I have put up, there's the sheet from last week, which had the definitions on, which you need to arrange to put in the right definitions. And I've also done a crossword for you, which hopefully you can see there, which I'd like you just to complete, which just really goes through the key terms that we've used in the last couple of lessons. And that's all. And if you can just make sure you've done those questions on adaptation that I asked you to do last week as well. And I suppose finally the other thing is just to go through the test and the mark scheme if you haven't done that already, just so that you know what was expected to get the marks. Okay, is everybody happy about that?
Have you marked the test, sir, that we did?
Yes. Have you not?
He has even unique.
Right. If you haven't had your, who was that saying you haven't had it back?
That was Ewan.
Oh, I just haven't noticed if you have.
Right. You should have had the. I sent everybody the mark scheme, I think on the Monday for most of you, and you should have had an email from Classmarker with the effectively your test and my marking of it and the feedback from it.
I can see the percentages, yeah.
If you haven't received that, then please email me and I will make sure I'll send it again, because a few people do seem to have had difficulty getting those.
Just go on Classmarker again and it will tell you what you got.
Yeah, so just check you've got that. If you haven't, email me and I can actually send it directly, but it comes out in a different format, which isn't as great.
It's really fine.
Okay, fine. Well, I can do that. I can just copy it and attach it to an email then. But it is an important part of the process that you look at the mark schemes and you see where you could have improved on it. Right. So next week we're going to do this practical activity, and again I think we'll have we'll stick with Friday as a lesson. I think I might try and ask you to do it before Friday, and then we can haven't quite worked out exactly how we're going to do it, but I'll stick with this time, 1 o'clock on Friday, for a lesson next week. So enjoy your VE Day celebrations tomorrow. Your hoovering, Fraser.
Thank you.
And have a good weekend. And I'll speak to you all next week.
See you then.
Right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye.